This is an image that belongs to the Pallava period, one of the early cave temples that is from Trichy. And in this particular cave temple, we have Gangadhara Shiva. As you can see, he is standing with his head on this little dwarf-like figure. This is a demonic figure who is supposed to represent ignorance, called apasmara, and you have him therefore in this very casual pose, but also pose that is immediately conveying the power of the deity. You have devotees on either side who are paying their obeisance to the deity. They are bowing before him. On top, you have the divinities who are shown, this is supposed to be possibly the sun and the moon, who are represented over here. You have other kinds of beings, divine beings, semi-divine beings also, who may be there in the background. So now in this image of Shiva, something that is very interesting is, of course, that he is four-armed. This is something that follows the textual prescription. One hand is in Kati Hasta, where he is actually resting his arm, the left arm, on his hip. And then he holds certain attributes which very clearly, immediately suggest that this is Lord Shiva. So he has a damaru in one hand, in the left top hand. He is holding this snake, this wriggling snake in one hand. In some of the texts, you have reference to a ball of fire that is being held in one of his hands. What is very interesting, you also have reference to the parashu that is being held, the axe that is being held in his hand. What is very interesting in this particular image is that he seems to be holding a lock of his hair. This is his jata. And in that lock of hair, you have Ganga, who is actually coming into that lock of hair, and he is now going to hold Ganga in his hair. Now, for those who are familiar with the epic Puranic mythology, they will immediately know what this myth or what this image is referring to, that it is referring to a myth of Shiva being Gangadhara, being the one who holds Ganga in his jatas. And why is this being done? This is being done because Bhagirath undertakes a penance, and he wants to find absolution. He wants to give salvation to his ancestors, the sons of Sagara, who trouble a sage when he is doing penance. And so the sage, out of anger, because his penance has been disrupted, he reduces them. He opens his eyes and he reduces them to ashes. And so so to give them moksha, he wants that the ashes be washed by the waters of the holy river Ganga, and he prays for this purpose. And the gods say that they cannot allow Ganga to come down to the earth because the entire earth will be washed away. She is so unruly, she is so torrential, she cannot be controlled, and therefore Bhagirath beseeches Lord Shiva and says that please allow that my ancestors be given moksha, and therefore carry Ganga in your head, and from your head, when she flows down onto the earth, she will be calmed, because Shiva's jata is so jatila, it is so thick and unruly that she's just moving around very fast in those jata, and all her energy is sapped away by that. And so when her energy is sapped, she can then be allowed to flow out of the jatas of Shiva onto the earth. So this very interesting myth that we have in the epic Puranic tradition is represented in this cave temple that is possibly dedicated to Shiva, where it is in the Gangadhara Murti form that we find the visual description and depiction of Shiva. Now, the very interesting thing, and this is something that I have discussed in this in my article in this book on art and history, is that this is a period of state formation. This is a period of expanding agriculture. This is a period when you have the need, therefore, for making the lands more cultivable. And for that, irrigation is of great importance. And the Cholas proclaim themselves at a later point of time as the lords of the Kaveri. But in this very early inscription that comes from the Trichy cave temple, we find the Pallava king talking of himself as the Lord of Kaveri, and he compares himself to Shiva, and he says that Shiva is, the one who holds Ganga in his head, and that is the reason why Shiva's consort Parvati has always been so jealous, and now Shiva is also looking outwards because the Kaveri is flowing down there. So not enough that he has Ganga on his head, he also wants Kaveri. And then the Pallava king says, I have control over Kaveri. So it's a very interesting kind of representation and depiction of the manner in which the control over the water, which the god here, Shiva, is being shown as having. And also through that inscription, the Pallava king is claiming that he has control over the waters. And here the waters that are being referred to is the water of the Kaveri. Right? So very important for us to interpret the visual depiction in terms of a broader context and not merely see this as a religious description. Of course, it's a religious description. No doubt about it. It refers to mythology that we find in the epics and which also we find in the Puranic tradition. But the fact that this image is used over here, and there is an inscription which is talking about the importance of the rivers and about the king's control, king as being the lord of the Kaveri, that is where the king is comparing himself with the gods, and he is showing that he also has control over the waters of the land. So an important political message that is also being conveyed in addition to the religious message that we find over here. Another very interesting and important image that we find related to kingship and to political power is the numerous images or iconography of Varaha Murti, which you can see in this slide now, where Varaha is Lord Vishnu in the form of a boar. And according to the Puranic mythology, when the Bhudevi, when Prithvi is abducted by a demon and taken into the nether regions, Vishnu takes the form of a boar and he digs deep down and goes into the ocean depths, and he retrieves Bhudevi, Prithvi, and he brings her back and restores her to her former glory. So in a way, and that is why Vishnu is referred to as Bhupati or Prithvipati. Now, something that is very interesting in a lot of Sanskrit prashastis is that the king is also referred to as Bhupati. King is also Prithvipati. So again, a very direct way in which the imagery of the god and the imagery of the king are deliberately being drawn out in such a way that there is legitimacy that is being sought for the king, through a comparison with the feats of the gods, and in this case the feat of Vishnu in the form of Varaha, in the avatar of Varaha. This is an image from the Adi Varaha cave in Mamallapuram, where you have Vishnu in the form of Varaha standing here to show that Vishnu has gone to the ocean depths to bring out Prithvi. You have this Naga king who is shown at the bottom. You have worshippers, sages. You have, again, the sun and the moon generally find representation in these kinds of panels. These are panel descriptions. So he's bringing Prithvi out, and the gods are thanking him. They are surrounding him. Mortals are also, the sages are also offering their thanks and worship to him. It's a sign of power, a sign of one who is a protector. So when we look at the visual imagery, it is not merely accidental that of all the avatars of Vishnu that are already known, why is the Varaha avatar chosen to be depicted in these cave temples? And it is not just in the Pallava domain, even in the Gupta domain. You have the Varaha imagery that is very popular. For instance, in cave number 5 at Udayagiri, you have this massive rock face that is there of Varaha actually holding Prithvi and coming out of the waters. And again, you have that panel is much larger than what you have in the Pallava cave temples. You have at the bottom a whole range of aquatic figures and Naga Devatas and Devis that are shown. You have several rishis who are shown, and several rudras that are shown, several gandharvas that are shown, several denizens of the heavens that are shown in that panel. So a whole range of imagery that comes up over there. This is more limited, but it certainly conveys that message very clearly, that like in Chandragupta II's image in Udayagiri, the kind of power that Varaha wields, where he is protecting the earth and all across the universe, he is being celebrated as the protector of the earth. That same idea is being conveyed in the Pallava images of Varaha. Another image, and this is also from the Adi Varaha cave temple, another image that conveys such power through the visual depiction of the mythology of Vishnu is that of Vishnu as Trivikrama. And what is this story of Trivikrama? You have again the Puranic story that is being alluded, where Raja Bali, who's a very good king, but he is born as a Rakshasa, he is born as a demon because of some past karma where he is cursed, and he is born, and he is told he will be redeemed by Lord Vishnu. So in the discussion or in the depiction of bhakti, this is one of the stories which talks about bhakti. And so Raja Bali is one who is very generous, and he gives dana to everybody, and he invites people to come and take dana so that he may do something that is good and earn religious merit. And so Vishnu, in the form of a dwarf-like figure, Vamana, the Vamana avatar, he goes to Raja Bali and he asks for something, and Raja Bali says that I have given away most of my things, but tell me what is it that you want. And the Vamana says that I only want enough place to take 3 strides. Whatever area the 3 strides cover, that is what you have to give to me. And so Raja Bali innocently agrees to it. And then what happens is that Vishnu shows his Virata Rupa, and in this form as Trivikrama, his great form, Virata Rupa, his great form, his magnificent and large form, and then he becomes what we refer to as Trivikrama in the Puranas. That is, he takes 1 foot and he covers the entire earth with that 1 stride. he takes a second stride and he covers the entire cosmos, and there is no place for him to take the third stride. And so Raja Bali offers his own head, and that is how Raja Bali is redeemed from his curse as a Rakshasa. He comes to his end, but it is something that it has been foretold that this will happen. So Vishnu is actually redeeming a good Rakshasa in this manner. And this is what is represented as the Trivikrama form. You find this in the Chalukya cave temples as well as in the Pallava cave temples. And here you have Vishnu standing Samabhanga, that is straight formed, and you have one leg that is raised upwards to show that he is covering the cosmos. And generally in these depictions, you will also have the figure of the Raja that is shown at the bottom. In the Chalukya cave temples, for instance, at Badami and Pattadakal, it is much more clearly visible. And then again, like in the other panels that we see generally in the Pallava cave temples, you have minor figures. You have the Gandharvas, you have Indra, you have other deities who are shown at the top. And you may have worshippers and sages who are shown at the bottom. So again, a very clear symbol of power, of the king's ability to conquer all lands, his right to capture all of the regions, and therefore he would be the lord of all of these regions. That is something that is very powerfully conveyed through such imagery. So it's not an accident that when you have a cave temple, you have 3 walls or 4 walls that are decorated, 3 walls generally, and in these walls that you choose specific kinds of figures, like that of Varaha, like that of Trivikrama. It clearly shows that there is a thought that is being given, a careful thought that is being given to the kind of images that are going to be portrayed. It is not a random use of imagery that we find in these depictions. In the same cave temple, you also find the depiction. This is not from this cave temple, I'm sorry. This is possibly from, actually it is from the same cave temple. You have this depiction of the goddess in Samabhanga again. She's straight, she is 4-armed, as you can see. She holds Vaishnava Ayudhas, that is the Shankha and the Chakra. And there is a parasol on top of her head, conveying her power and authority. And you have these pot-bellied Gana figures who are possibly her attendants. And very interestingly, if you look at the base near her feet, you have 2 people who are shown over here who are worshipping her in a very interesting manner. On the one hand, you have one person who's holding a sword as if to his neck, and he's holding his own hair up on top in a bun, and he seems to be holding a sword in such a way as if he's decapitating himself. The other image that you see over here is of a devotee where he is holding a small khadga, not as big a sword, a small khadga over here, where he's actually trying to cut off something, it seems, from his arm. Clearly, it is flesh that is being cut off from his arms. What we also find in this image is at the top, there are these 2 depictions of animals. One is of the Simha, and the other is of a mriga. In the depiction in the Pallava cave temples, you have several such depictions of panels of the goddess where she is standing surrounded by these figures of animals at the top and with these devotees at the bottom. What does it signify? In my work, Making of the Goddess Kottravai Durga in the Tamil traditions, I have discussed this in very great detail about how Kottravai is an indigenous Tamil goddess known to us in the Sangam literature. She is known as the goddess of war and victory. She is known as the goddess who rides on the stag. She is referred to as Pai Kalai Pavai. She is the one who rides on the stag that is moving very fast. She is the one who lives in forests. She is the one who is propitiated by blood, by offerings of flesh. And in the Sanskritic traditions, we know in the epics as well as in the Purans of the goddess Durga, who is talked of as Simhavahini. She is also someone who is very fierce. She, in some of the myths that are there about Durga, she is also one who demands a blood sacrifice. So what is happening in this Pallava period depiction is a very interesting syncretism that is occurring. A very interesting bringing together of two different traditions, one being the northern Brahmanical, Puranic, Sanskritic tradition, and the other being the indigenous southern Tamil traditions of worship of a goddess. So both these goddesses have certain qualities that are very similar, and by bringing these two together into the same frame, they are suggesting that they are one and the same goddess, that they are just different depictions, but they are one and the same. So the way in which, when we talk about religious syncretism does not happen in a vacuum. Religious syncretism has to be understood in a context where there is an effort that is being made, and here the effort is being made by the kings and their ideologues. The kings, as B.D. Chattopadhyay has shown so beautifully in his article on political processes in early India, where this was his presidential address to the Indian History Congress, I think in 1982. I may be wrong on the date, but this is reproduced in his volume, The Making of Early Medieval India. In this particular essay, he talks in great detail about how different regions saw the beginnings of state formation and the emergence of a strong state only in the post-Gupta or maybe even the later Gupta phase, in the early medieval period in particular, and that it happens in very, very different and disparate regional contexts in different and disparate ways. And the reason why it happens in different and disparate ways is because of the manner in which local traditions are being assimilated and amalgamated with non-local Sanskritic traditions, and because these regional states are emerging mainly by utilizing a Sanskritic language of political power. This is something that has been described and discussed in very great detail by Sheldon Pollock when he talks about the language of the gods and the world of men. This huge book. What is the main essence of this work? He says that in the early Indian context, political power is being proclaimed primarily through the use of Sanskrit language. So it becomes the language of political power. And so you have the development of certain genres like Kavya, where you have a very flowery and ornamental language and imagery that is developing. That imagery is also associated with the ruler. You also have the prashastis that are coming up, where in Sanskrit, beautiful descriptions of the kings, comparing them to the gods, comparing them to the divine beings and their feats, comparing them to the epic heroes. So a lot of simultaneous literary output that is occurring, all of it is in Sanskrit. And in these different regional pockets where the local polities are becoming more powerful, they use Sanskrit, and they use it primarily because of the influence of a new social element that has arrived in those different localities and regions, and those are the Brahmanas. Brahmanas who carry their Brahmanical knowledge, who carry the understanding of the importance of political power and legitimacy, and they claim to give these kings legitimacy. And therefore, it is in the course of that process of change where the local is seeking to express itself as something that is grand, that is beyond the local, that is translocal, that is regional, and even going beyond the regional. It uses Sanskrit and the Sanskritic language of power to claim this status for itself. So in the Pallava context, the very fact that you have the kings using Sanskrit as their language of expression is something that occurs because of the influence of the Brahmanas. We find numerous inscriptions that are talking about the bringing of the Brahmanas into the region. We find great details that are provided of villages that are being granted and shares within the villages that are being granted. In some cases, we have 108 Brahmanas mentioned. In some, we have 300 Brahmanas mentioned. In some, we have 40 Brahmanas mentioned. So you have numerous such inscriptions which are telling you of large numbers of Brahmins that are being brought in. In fact, T.K. Venkata Subramaniam, in his presidential address to the ancient section of the Indian History Congress, talks about the different Brahmin groups who can be identified, because in the inscriptions, there is reference to their gotras, to the shakhas and pravaras also. That is, the particular lineage of the Brahmins can actually be traced, to show that they are not coming from one place, they are coming from several places, mostly coming via Andhra into the region. But the fact is that you have a new element that is being brought into the Tamil region. And when a new element comes in, it always seeks to establish itself. And so to establish itself, it needs to bond with the local, with the indigenous. And it is in the course of that assimilations take place. There are cultural bonds of a different type that we can see, where some of the local practices are adopted by the Brahmanas. Again, ethno-historical studies convey this kind of assimilation to us. So some of the local, traditions of tying the some thread and performing certain pujas to the trees and the ponds and so on, these are adopted by the Brahmins who come into a region, possibly because of the local custom. But you also have at the religious level, at a broader level, some other kinds of assimilations that are taking place. And here, one such assimilation can be seen through such a visual depiction, where you have a Tamil goddess and a Sanskritic goddess known to us in the Puranic, epic Puranic tradition, how they are brought together and assimilated. So again, while the earlier set of images that I referred to primarily deal with political power and its signification and how it is being portrayed through the selection of certain visual imagery, here we find that a different process, a process of religious interaction, and assimilation is being so beautifully conveyed through an image of this kind of a depiction of the goddess who is both Kotravai as well as Durga. You have other very important, depictions of the Pallava period, like this depiction of Mahishasur-mardini. And I again am showing you this mainly because the feats of the goddess here as a great warrior, the king also as being a great warrior, something that is being emphasized in the Prashastis of the rulers that are already being composed by this point of time. So when we look at such imagery, these are meant to convey that kind of importance that is being accorded to the martial prowess of the rulers and of the ruling class. But something else that is very important here, and that is why I put this slide in, is that here you have actually a battle scene that is being depicted. Again, this is only in some context that you will find that the Mahishasur-mardini image is shown in this manner. Where an actual battle scene is being depicted. In the Chalukya region also, you will find this kind of depiction. In these Pallava images, what is very striking is that the image of Mahisha is also one of power. And this takes us to that very important question raised by D.D. Kosambi about how Mahisha himself may have been a buffalo god, a god who was worshipped by pastoral people, people for whom the herding of buffaloes was very important. There was possibly a cult that was developed around a buffalo figure and who gets an anthropomorphic form as Mahisha. And it is in that clash between the local and the Sanskritic that we see the evolution of the mythology of Mahishasur-mardini. So in the earlier image, where you see difference between the local and the Sanskritic, but there is an attempt at assimilation. In the Mahishasur-mardini mythology, it is possible that there is a difference between the local and the Sanskritic, and it is resolved by showing this in terms of conflict, where Durga becomes then the vanquisher, the one who defeats Mahisha, and the cult of Mahisha is thereby marginalized. At the village level, many anthropologists like MLK Murthy have shown that even today there is buffalo worship, the worship of Mahisha by the pastoral people, and there are annual festivals in his honor that are commemorated. But in the Sanskritic tradition, and as I've said, the kings, as part of the state formation, as part of their assertion of kingship in the language of power, which is Sanskrit, they are using the Sanskritic mythology where Durga becomes the vanquisher of the buffalo demon, and there is no attempt at assimilation of these cults. Other mythology that again comes up is, and this is in the Mahishasur-mardini cave in Mamallapuram. The previous image is also from there, which shows the panel of the battle scene. This is a scene where Vishnu is in Yoga Nidra, and these are the demons Madhu and Kaitabha, who seem to be retreating from the scene. As you can see, he is looking backwards, one of the demons. Here, Vishnu is reclining on Adisesha, Seshanag, and on his serpent bed. And you have Bhudevi, who is at his feet, who is worshipping him, who is beseeching him to protect her from these demons, Madhu and Kaitab. So you have actually, again, the notion of the king as the protector of the earth that is being conveyed through such imagery. And again, the protector of the people. This is a very interesting, cave that we have of Krishna lifting the Govardhana Giri. And this is one which we may see again as reflecting the protective aspect of the king, of the leader, of the ruler, and this is being conveyed through such imagery. So certainly the religious imagery has its roots in the Puranic tradition, in the epic traditions, but it is not as if all the depictions or all the mythology that is there in the epics and Puranas actually get visualized, get depicted. There are some that are chosen, they are chosen precisely so that they may be used to convey certain dominant ideas, certain important ideas, certain significant ideas relating to power, relating to kingship, relating to religious assimilation, relating to religious conflict even, and the manner in which these are done is not accidental. It is not something that is arbitrary, but there is a very carefully chosen set of images, and there is also a carefully visualized space within which those images can be conveyed, can be represented and depicted. So clearly, when we are talking about issues of signification, we do need to keep the larger historical context in mind. This is a period from the 6th to the 9th centuries, which continues up till the 13th century under the Cholas. But under the Pallavas, what we see clearly is territorial expansion and an integration of different localities. You find numerous chieftains of particular places that are mentioned in the inscriptions, how they are accepting the suzerainty of the Pallava monarch, and later in Chola times of the Chola kings. So it is in that context of territorial expansion and integration that we need to look at the way in which religion, religious mythology, religious ideas, and the new kind of worship that is being expounded in the Puranic literature is being used as a legitimating tool by the rulers who are, after all, the primary patrons of the Brahmanical tradition. I think I have run out of time, and so I will stop with this discussion. I have several other things to talk about, but since I cannot, I will refer you to some of the works that may be of interest. I'm going to skip through this entire section, which is on syncretic images, and I will take you directly to the bibliography, a select bibliography that I have prepared, where amongst the most important works as far as understanding Brahmanical iconography is concerned are the works of T.A. Gopinath Rao, Elements of Hindu Iconography, which is in 4 volumes. Volume 1 has 2 parts and volume 2 as well, and each of these parts are separate volumes. Then the work of G.N. Banerjee, The Development of Hindu Iconography, extremely important to understand the Brahmanical traditions. They use a whole range of Shilpa Shastric, epic Puranic literature to present in a very simple way the different images that actually find a place on the walls of the Hindu temples. The works of scholars like Padma Kaimal, I have mentioned over here, as well as Vidya Dahejia, whom I have not mentioned, or that of R. Nagaswamy and K.R. Srinivasan. They are extremely important. Padma Kaimal and Vidya Dahejia primarily focus on the art historical aspects, but also look at the social dimensions of art. So very, very important works. R. Nagaswami's work, as well as that of T.V. Mahalingam that I have mentioned over here, Nageshwara Swami Temple. This is an essay, a long essay that actually talks about different kinds of iconography pertaining to the early medieval period in Tamil Nadu. An extremely important article that is of relevance even today. R. Nagaswami's numerous works on art and architecture. He's an archaeologist of great standing, and he's one of those who's very well known for having brought back from England and other places very beautiful and priceless bronze images that had been stolen, that had been looted and taken away from the country. But the important thing is, in his numerous works on art and architecture, he gives you a very holistic understanding of how to place the evolution and development of art and architecture in Tamil Nadu as well as in South India in general. The works of Champakalakshmi, of Ellen Goldberg, and in my own work, we try to look at the historical dimensions when we study the visual representations, and Ellen Goldberg focuses on one specific icon, the Ardhanarishwara image, and she looks at the different ways in which Ardhanarishwara is depicted in the literature, and then also looks at the iconography from across India. Champakalakshmi, in her work on religion, tradition, and ideology, it's a set of essays. The essays on the Brahmanical religion, on the Puranic tradition, on the Brahmins and the bringing of the Brahmins to the Tamil region and South India, as well as in her discussion of Shankaracharya, throws up many important ideas through which we can contextualize the way in which the Brahmanical religion finds a space visually in the Deep South. And in my own work, as I've already mentioned, in the making of the goddess, I look at goddess traditions in particular, the Sanskritic tradition, the local tradition, the assimilations, as well as where there is no assimilation. And in the edited volume on art and history that I brought out last year, there are some interesting articles from across the Indian subcontinent which talk, for instance, about social imagination and the way in which it is conveyed through certain kinds of imagery, the way in which religious syncretism occurs, for instance, in Jainism, the way in which hero stones may be understood as a religio-cultural expression, which is rendered visually in different parts of the subcontinent. So a very diverse range of issues that are raised in these works. And of course, all of these works will also have bibliographies which may take you to more readings on this theme if you are so inclined. Thank you very much.
थैंक यू मैम, इतनी डिटेल में और इतनी बेहतरीन लेक्चर आपका, एकदम से लगता है कि सुनते ही रहें, और 2 घंटे कैसे निकल गए हमें पता ही नहीं चला। तो मैम बहुत ही खास करके कई बार ऐसा होता है कि आर्ट हिस्ट्री पे मुझे लगता था कि लेक्चर बोरिंग हो जाता है, लेकिन यहाँ तो इतनी इंटरेस्टिंग तरीके से आपने खास करके जो डिफरेंट जो इमेजेस और उनका सोशल पॉलिटिकल जो कॉन्टेक्स्ट है उस संदर्भ में आपने बताया, और वेरियस जो कल्ट है उसकी भी इसमें बात आई है। दुर्गा, महिषासुर वाली जो बात है वो बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग लगा। तो रियली मैम वी एंजॉय लॉट्स, मतलब ये ऐसा लेक्चर जनरली सुनने को नहीं मिलता है। और मैं ये भी कहूँगा कि मुझे ऐसा लग रहा है कि आप तो आर्ट हिस्ट्री में यहाँ पर आप तो इंसाइक्लोपीडिया है मैम, जिस तरह से आपके टिप्स पे सारी चीजें जिस तरह से आपको याद हैं और जिस जिस फ्लो में आप चीजों को पेश कर रही हैं, वो रियली रियली मार्वेलस। सो थैंक यू मैम, थैंक्स लॉट, एंड आई होप कि ये जो लेक्चर है, ये जब हमारे सारे जो रेफरेंस कोर्स में जो लोग सुनेंगे तो बहुत सारा उनके तरफ से जो है इस लेक्चर्स पे जो उनका जो कमेंट आएगा फिर हम वो आपके साथ शेयर करेंगे। और आई रियली थैंकफुल फॉर यू कि बहुत ही अच्छा, बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग लेक्चर। थैंक यू मैम।
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you ma'am, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
But,
So shall we, can I disconnect?
No,
I hope I'll have the opportunity to meet you once the pandemic is over. I look forward to that.
Ma'am, we
Thank
have
you
one
very
question.
much. Yes, Shishir?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am, because so nicely you have presented everything that you have presented. But, ma'am, one question is that as we know about the political processes, okay, in early medieval period, because I think A. Southall has discussed about the greater tradition and little traditions. Okay, so in this realm, I think can we say कि इसी तरह से जो है सो मुझे आर्ट हिस्ट्री में ग्रेटर ट्रेडिशन और लिटिल ट्रेडिशन का नोशन हमें दिखता हो? First,
actually it's a very good question. Thank you.
Second question, ma'am. In early medieval period, okay, I think we have several monasteries in India. Okay, so we have severally find that there was the contestations within the sects.
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay, so इसी तरह का हमें इमेज में भी रिफ्लेक्शन मिलता है और मिला है?
Yeah, I could not show you. Okay, so I'll start with the second question because my second set of slides was going to focus on this. And I was going to talk about conflict. I already mentioned conflict when I was talking about the Mahishasur-Mardini imagery, because clearly while in the Sanskritic texts, I'm talking of both the religious texts as well as the Shilpa Shastric tradition. दोनों में ही जिस तरह का विवरण है महिष के बारे में भी और दुर्गा के बारे में भी, दुर्गा is shown as more powerful because she has all the ayudhas and all the attributes of all the gods that is given to her. What we find is that Mahisha is strong because of his penance and he gets some boons, but ultimately he is vanquished by Durga, mainly because she is the embodiment of the Shakti of all the deities, right? There itself you find that there is a, shall we say, bias would be a wrong word, but there is clearly an indication that in the Sanskritic tradition, more importance is being given to the goddess, clearly, because the Rakshasa is a Rakshasa. He is against the gods. Now, in the visual depiction, as I was trying to point out to you, in that battle scene, what we have is the goddess who is shown on the lion, and she's quite powerful. She has 8 arms and she has all these ayudhas in her arms. The lion is also very fierce and it seems to be jumping across into the scene. What we find is Mahisha, even though he is fleeing from the scene, even then he is a very imposing figure. So in art traditions, when we talk about visual representation, one of the important prescriptions is to convey power. You will show a difference in size between the main figure and what is seen as a minor figure or as the opposing figure. Now, in this case, the opposing figure is the demon, is Rakshasa, and he is Mahisha, but he is shown as this huge figure. And ye ek hi udaharan nahi, there are many such representations of the Pallava period and also from the Chalukya regions, which show this, which indicates that possibly Mahisha represents a local cult, a pastoral people's cult, and it is, and therefore Mahisha is worshipped in this region from the Western Deccan down to South India, to the Tamil region in the south. So that could be the only explanation that we can find for this kind of a visual representation. We may observe that this is a possibility. Okay, over here. So clearly sectarian difference is there. I did not mention many other such sectarian differences that are there, whether in the Puranic mythology of Shiva as the pillar of fire, Lingodbhava. So Shiva as Lingodbhava Murti is very popular in South India as well as in other parts of India, but particularly in South India is very popular. Why? Because there is sectarian conflict. We know that the Pallavas were great followers of Vishnu. They also patronized Shiva and Shiva temples, but they were great worshippers of Vishnu. So we know of the Cholas being great worshippers of Shiva, right? But that they also patronized the temples of Vishnu. So what would have been the context is this, that the ideologues of the Shaivites and of the Vaishnavites, in order to draw the patronage away from the other, they would give importance to a particular kind of imagery. So the Lingodbhava imagery becomes very powerful and strong in the Chola period, in particular in the Tamil region, right? So you have many such things that come up. On the mathas, I don't really have the time to go into it, but in the context of Central India, Tamara Sears has done some excellent work. Even before Tamara Sears, there are other scholars who have looked at the many inscriptions that we have of the Mattamayura sect and the mathas that they established across that region. The different Tantric Shaivism is becoming very important in the early medieval period. And it is primarily in the context of the Tantric Shaiva lineages. As you know, within the Tantric Shaiva tradition itself, there are different schools, but to establish their different lineages also, that they had their own traditions that were developing. So you have a lot of sectarian conflict, certainly, that is visible, a lot of sectarian assertion, which may be placed within this milieu of competition for patronage, that we can certainly see. And the first point that you made about great tradition and little tradition, certainly there is a difference in the visualization. So on the one hand, you may have the great monumental temples. You even have temples that are being built in small villages. But these villages are being developed as important nodal centers in the early medieval period. They are nodal centers of exchange, or they are centers where resource mobilization is being done through the temples. And many scholars have talked about it. But so we have, even at the temple, at the village level temples, but almost every temple in every part of India has its own local temples, which need not even be built structures, which need not even have permanent images, which may have images that are made of clay, and they're also then immersed into water. We don't call it destruction. We call it a visarjana, mainly to say it is a dissolution. It is something where it disintegrates and then it will be brought together again. And that's why the clay of the river only is used later also. So you have so many local traditions also that are there. Stella Kramrisch has worked a lot on this, and also Pupul Jayakar in this very interesting work called The Earthen Drum. She talks about this, about how terracotta, for instance, terracotta imagery, we tend to, refer to it today as folk art, folk tradition, and so on. But at the local level, these are the images that are there. So it's certainly an important point that you have a visualization that can be different at the level of what you refer to as the great tradition. That is where the tradition is patronized by the royalty, for instance, by important personages, the socio-economic elite, and those that are there at the local level, where amongst the community of washer people, amongst the community of potters, amongst the community of fisher folk, they may have their own traditions, their own ways of visualizing their divinities. Right? So when we talk about assimilation, syncretism and all, it doesn't mean that everything gets assimilated. There is a lot still in the realm of the unassimilated, in the realm of the little tradition that is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.